landscape, I think it's important to first remember just what a remarkable landscape we have in North Georgia. Focusing on the ecosystems, one thing that makes this area remarkable is our biodiversity. Great biodiversity of plants around here. Georgia has more species of trilliums than anywhere else in the world. And if you go for kind of a long hike in the mountains and you get into some different habitats, you can see 50 different tree species in a single day. And in all of Europe, there's 80-something tree species. So the Chattahoochee National Forest has more species of trees than an entire continent. And the fungal diversity matches the diversity. We've got mycorrhizal fungi like this amanita. We've got lichens that can grow on the toughest, most inhospitable places. And those plants and fungi are helping form the habitat for a wealth of different animals. We've got hundreds of bird species, either as residents that are here year-round, or migrants that come in for just part of the year. And I can't talk about diversity in the Southern Appalachians without talking about salamanders, because this region has more species of salamanders than anywhere else in the world. And, I think that biodiversity really adds to the scenic value of this area. And of course, the landscape itself is beautiful. And that's part of the reason why we love this area and we want to live here, and why other people want to visit this area. And of course, recreation and visitors drives the economy in our mountain towns, so our communities really do depend on our wild areas. And we depend on our wild areas directly because our drinking water comes out of the forest. This fisherman is in the Chattahoochee River, so this water is going to literally come out of the taps of millions of people downstream. And many of our mountain communities have their municipal water supply coming off of national forest land. So there's really a lot at stake when we talk about threats to the landscape. And to understand those threats, I want to take a step back first and think about what really impacts an ecosystem. And why do we have a pine forest instead of a hardwood forest? Or why do we have a forest at all instead of a prairie? What's shaping our communities? And there's three big factors to that. The first are the physical conditions that create the kind of raw resources that species are working with. And then species also interact not just with the abiotic environment, but also the other species in the ecosystem. So we can only have the species at any particular spot that are in the broader area. And then finally, ecosystems aren't static. They're impacted by disturbances all the time. And what those disturbances are and how often they occur changes the ecosystems we have. So when we talk about threats to the landscape, fundamentally they are altering one of these three factors. So a key part of the physical environment is the climate. We have a fairly moist climate around here. North Georgia gets 50 to 80 inches of precipitation a year, depending on exactly where you are. And crucially, that precipitation falls relatively evenly throughout the year. One month may be a little bit wetter than another month, but we don't have a distinct dry season. And because of that precipitation pattern, our landscape is predominantly forested. And then temperature-wise, we get freezing temperatures consistently during the winter, but those freezing temperatures don't spread over that much of the year. So we combine readily available moisture with seasons, but not extreme seasons. And that's why our forests are, mostly hardwood with some conifers mixed in. And then those forests are growing on bedrock. The rock underneath the mountains has a big impact on the soils and the vegetation that grows on them. And in North Georgia, our bedrock is predominantly crystalline rocks. On the Chattahoochee National Forest, it's especially mica schist and gneiss. An important factor of crystalline rocks is that they mostly weather into acidic soils, which means that some nutrients like iron are readily available, while other nutrients like calcium and magnesium can be in fairly short supply. So that's going to impact the ecosystems that grow on top of them. And then the topography, shape of the land itself, has a big influence on the communities and the climate and soils again. So there's a different climate at the foot of the mountain than there is at the top of the mountain. Conditions get cooler and wetter as we move up the mountain. And we'll have different kinds of forests and different kinds of ecosystems next to a stream versus on top of a ridge, and on a cool, moist, north-facing slope versus a hotter, drier, south-facing slope. So all those physical factors set the stage for the ecosystems we have. And then different species of plant are going to interact with that physical landscape. So we're not going to have redwoods in our forest because even if the climate were right, there's no redwoods in this area. And tulip poplar or tulip tree is a common species on our moister sites because it's here, but we only have one species of tulip poplar because glaciation wiped out the other species of tulip poplar. So history has altered the species pool, and history can be an important factor in determining our ecosystems, mostly by changing what disturbances hit the ecosystem. So disturbances, like a tornado, this is a tornado swath that went through north of Helen, are constantly changing our ecosystem. So we'll have different species present if we're looking a year or 10 years or 100 years after disturbance. That change in species over time is called succession. And the pattern of disturbances has a big impact on what ecosystems we get. In this region, we talk about fire as an important disturbance a lot, and it certainly is an important disturbance. Wind is also a really important disturbance. It can come really dramatically like this tornado. More often, it's going to be just knocking over one or small groups at a time, creating these gaps in the canopy. And how often and how intense those disturbances are has a big impact on the ecosystem. And then nowadays we have not only natural disturbances, but also human-caused disturbances. And human-caused disturbances can look kind of similar to natural disturbances, but they are distinct and impact ecosystem and species in ways that natural disturbances don't. And we're going to get into that more later. So when we're talking about threats to the landscape, they're going to impact one of these basic factors: the physical conditions, the species pool, or the patterns of disturbance that are impacting our ecosystems. And those factors, to me, all seem like they should be fairly stable, and naturally they would change only slowly, but people are impacting all of them these days. The one way that we're doing that probably gets the most attention is climate change. Our climate in North Georgia, we are seeing trends over the last few decades that seem likely to continue over coming decades. Our weather, the weather is getting warmer in North Georgia. We aren't seeing changes in the absolute amount of precipitation, but we are seeing changes in the pattern of precipitation. Rainfall events are becoming more intense, so we're getting precipitation in shorter bursts. And one impact of that is we get more runoff. So our streams are becoming flashier, water levels are rising and dropping faster. That's impacting the animals that live in our streams. And then because runoff is happening faster, that's meaning less water is seeping into the soil. So you combine less water infiltration with higher temperatures. Higher temperatures mean more demand and use of water by our plants and animals. And the overall effect is that our ecosystems are drying out even as the absolute amount of rain falling remains the same. And those changing physical conditions are going to change what species can survive on the landscape. So we're probably going to lose species like yellow birch and other species that are more common further north. Today, yellow birch only survives on our highest mountains. So as the climate warms and becomes drier, there may not be any place on the landscape that's suitable for that species. Other species are going to survive on the landscape or have the potential to survive on the landscape if we give them opportunities to migrate and move across the landscape. Species will move to stay in climates that are similar to the climate they evolved in. So species are going to have to move north overall to stay in relatively cool conditions. And in North Georgia, we have two big, relatively intact corridors where species can migrate across the landscape. There's the corridor along the Appalachian Trail. The Appalachian Trail follows our most continuous, highest ridge of mountains, the Blue Ridge in North Georgia. And then we have a low elevation corridor along the Chattooga River. So keeping those corridors intact and unfragmented is going to be important for allowing species to migrate. And species are also going to migrate upslope. So the conditions at the foot of the mountain may become too hot and dry for the species that are there today. But if they move upslope, even as the higher elevations dry, the high elevations of tomorrow may have climate that is generally similar to the low elevations of today. So species moving upslope may be a way that they can stay in an environment that is suitable for them. And some species are going to have an easier time moving than others. So I chose this photo because I wanted a picture of a butterfly in here, because butterflies, they have a short generation time, they're very mobile. So they are a group of organisms that they can move north a little bit every year and kind of keep up with the conditions that they need. But then I thought about it more and realized a monarch butterfly like we have here is actually a really vulnerable species, because they overwinter down in Mexico, and the oak forests they need are restricted to the high elevation. So as the climate changes there, they can't move up any farther. So monarch butterflies are actually very vulnerable. The species in this photo that's actually better set up to move in response to climate change is the blackberry. That's what's flowering here. Blackberries are dispersed by animals, including birds, which means that they can move pretty far each year. And blackberries are also, a species or a group of species that depend on disturbance, which climate change is going to create more of. So they're set up pretty well. A group of species that is not set up so well are salamanders. Our salamanders have very small range sizes. The salamander over the course of its life might only go 10 feet in one direction and 10 feet in the other direction. And salamanders also avoid dry habitats like our ridge tops, which means there's lots of barriers on the landscape that prevent them from moving around. So species like this that don't disperse very well on their own, it's really important for us to make sure that what we do to the landscape doesn't create additional barriers. So logging projects are hard on salamanders, and they really need to be designed in ways that don't create any more barriers than they have to. Like a logging road can be a barrier, and how a culvert installed can really change if a salamander can move up a stream corridor or not. So the importance of unfragmented landscape means it's really important for us to preserve our least fragmented landscapes that we have, and those are our roadless areas. And Forest Watch over the last few years have really focused on our roadless areas. That's why we revised the Georgia Mountain Treasures, which is the guide to our most intact and pristine roadless areas in North Georgia. Hopefully Andrew can throw up the link to that on our website. So that really profiles areas that have the greatest potential to let species move across the landscape. So our physical conditions are changing on the landscape, and that's impacting species pools, patterns, and the species pool is changing directly because people are bringing in species that have never been here before. So those are invasive species. They're species that people have moved here often from another continent. And what we want to avoid with invasive species is this scenario where we lose our native species and then species from other places are here just duking it out. So in this case, this is a princess tree. That's what's got those great big leaves on it. It's our fastest growing invasive tree. And here it is competing with our fastest growing invasive vine, kudzu, that we all know. In this case, the kudzu is winning. And this is a shot just down the street from me in my neighborhood. The kudzu is also competing with Chinese privet and Japanese knotweed, which are holding up a little bit better. When we talk about invasive species, kind of the default is to talk about invasive plants. And the threat with invasive plants is that they will compete so effectively that they displace our native species. And one way that they're able to do that is because they've been brought here on their own, they've come here without some of the species that would normally keep them in check. Insects that feed on them, diseases that attack them, and that gives them kind of a competitive advantage. So a species like Japanese stiltgrass, which is what this green layer is on the forest floor, can kind of run amok. And Japanese stiltgrass can get so dense that no other species can compete with it. And it will suppress tree species seedlings. And this is a shot from a little residential development right outside of LOJ. And then invasive species can straight up eliminate native species from the landscape. The most famous example is chestnut blight eliminating American chestnut. More recently, hemlock woolly adelgid has come through and wiped out most of our hemlock trees. And then right now we're facing emerald ash borer. So we're losing species from our landscape. And this is something we can do something about. We can push back against this. Last year, Georgia Forest Watch treated a couple of groves of ash trees with chemicals to protect them from emerald ash borer. And I drove by one of those sites a couple of weeks ago, and the trees were looking pretty good. So this is a big threat that we push back against some. And the kind of forgotten part of invasive species, I think, often are invasive animals that aren't pests that just feed on one species. And one of the worst ones are hogs. So introduced from Europe and Asia, feed on both plants and animals. And they really like moist, soft soil to root around in, which means they really like our mountain bogs, which are a rare habitat we've already lost. So some places where groups are working to restore mountain bogs, They've planted species like rare pitcher plants, but they had to put the plants that they've planted in cages to protect them from the hogs. So they'll go back to one of these sites, the plants inside the cage are fine, but everything around them has been rooted up. And the Forest Service has actually been trying to control hogs at specific sites some. So they have what are called corral traps. It's a fenced in area, maybe 20, 25 feet across, and put bait in there to draw the hogs in. And then there's a gate that can be triggered electronically so they can catch a whole sounder of hogs at once. And they've had one of these corral traps out near a mountain bog restoration site. And I think in 1 year they caught 200 hogs, but the hogs are still tearing up the site. These things reproduce really fast and are a real big challenge to get control of. So this is one more python than you were expecting to see in today's presentation. And you haven't missed any big news. There's not pythons in North Georgia. But I have it in here because climate change is connected to invasive species. Just like the ranges of our native species are changing, the ranges of invasive species are also changing. So invasive species that are currently just a problem in Florida and South Georgia may become a problem in North Georgia over the coming decades. So that's enough on the kind of gloom and doom side of invasive species. There are a number of ways that we can help combat them. One thing we really need is just better information about where invasive species are on the landscape. And there's some good apps that can help people report on that. So Seed In on the left is an app that lets you report where you're seeing invasive species. And it's got a good bit of identification resources built into it. So if you're not sure exactly which species you're looking at or if it's invasive or not, Seed In can be a helpful app to use to help determine if you are seeing an invasive species or not, in addition to reporting it. If a lot of this conversation is old hat to you and you know the common invasive species already, you may want to use EdMaps Pro. It's a streamlined reporting service to try to make it quick to report invasive species. So if you're out hiking, you can take just a few minutes to stop and report invasive species that you see along the trail or even along the road on the drive into the trail. And if you're an active hiker and out a good bit each year, you can cover quite a bit of ground, and we really don't need that many people doing that to really make a fundamental difference in how much we know about invasive species on the forest. And then that kind of information helps plan and prioritize direct action, because we can't tackle every invasive species in every invasive species population. We want to focus our efforts on the smaller and newer invasions where the species isn't out of control yet. So we do things like this workday to remove princess tree or paulownia in the Cohuttas. It came in after the big 2016 wildfires. And we had a couple work days to cut them out of the area. And the Forest Service has specifically requested help in mapping the remaining princess tree in the Cohuttas. So this is one place where using those apps, if we get that data, the Forest Service will directly use on it. And then the really long-term solutions for invasive species are going to come from research. And we have some people doing great research in North Georgia. University of North Georgia Ecological Protection Lab is working on biological control for Hemlock woolly adelgid. They are raising insects that come from the adelgid's home territory in Japan and the Pacific Northwest, and raising the species that feed specifically on the adelgid. And we don't know the ultimate outcome of that, but they do have one species that seems to be very active at feeding on the adelgid for part of the year. It's establishing and surviving and spreading on its own now. So invasive species are attacking the species pool on the landscape, but we are pushing back. And then being in the Atlanta area, we've got to talk about sprawl and urbanization. I think I saw one report that said the Chattahoochee National Forest is #2 in the country for expected population growth and development around it. And the biggest threat from population growth is just the direct habitat destruction. So kind of the obvious impact. There are some indirect impacts that may be less obvious. Urbanization and population growth promotes invasive species, because many of our invasive species are coming out of ornamentals that are planted in people's yards. I know there's plenty of invasives that are in people's yards in my neighborhood. And then there's impact beyond just the footprint of the development. This is a power line that went in back in the early 2000s to supply power to a gated community, but it cut across the whole landscape, fragmenting our forest, which poses challenges for responding to climate change. And this particular shot is from an outlying Forest Service parcel that the Forest Service is considering selling off. And there's a bit of an interaction between land sales and population growth. This is a tract outside of Clayton, close to 800 acres that the county, that Raven County is encouraging the Forest Service to sell. And the Forest Service, or the county, wants it sold because they want to buy it to expand their landfill. So population growth is driving the need for a bigger landfill, and the consequence of that is this area that is protected now may lose its protection. And then recreation, so as more people live close to the forest, more people will recreate in the forest. And overall, I think that's a great thing. People need to know and love their local forest to protect it. But there is a dark side to recreation also, particularly motorized recreation. So this is the Locust Stake ATV trail system. It's a designated trail system by the Forest Service. So back in the 80s, the Forest Service got a mandate that they were supposed to support motorized recreation. So they looked around for how they could establish ATV trails. And they said, oh, we've got a bunch of old logging roads in the Locust Stake area. We can just convert those to ATV trails. But they didn't do a soils analysis to see if the soils in that area could support the ATV traffic. And what you see here is what we have about 3 decades later. Soils couldn't support the ATV traffic, and the ATVs running back and forth created this 12-foot deep trench. And all the soil in that trench didn't just disappear. We got these big sediment plumes coming off of it, and that made its way all the way to our streams. And a lot of the insects that live in streams and become food for trout, they live in those cobbles and rocks on the stream bed, and here their habitat has been just smothered. So this is an area that Forest Watch got involved in. The worst of those trails by the Forest Service, and the other trails in the area are closed at the moment, and the Forest Service has no plans to reopen them. So that's a really extreme example. You will see more mild examples all over the forest where people either on an ATV or a full-size Jeep are driving off of the roads. Leaving the roads in a vehicle is illegal, and you can report it to the Forest Service. The Forest Service is understaffed these days, so often they don't know about these illegal trails on the forest, and they will take action on them. So the Forest Service recently sent out a special law enforcement detail to write tickets on one area that had a lot of dirt bike traffic getting off of the roads. So this is a really simple way where people can get involved. If you see this, call up your local ranger district and tell them where you're seeing people getting off the roads, because it has an impact on erosion, and the health of our streams. So Forest Watch is involved in that issue. The biggest issue we're involved in is resource extraction, and we don't have much mining going on around here or grazing. So resource extraction mostly means logging. So the national forest is not the same thing as a national park. National parks like Great Smoky Mountains and Congaree National Park are set up specifically for preservation, both nature preservation and cultural preservation, and allowing people to see those areas. The national forest, though, has a multi-use mandate. It's supposed to be kind of all things to all people. So it's supposed to support hiking, hunting, ATV riding. It's supposed to protect plants and animals. It's also supposed to protect timber. So the Chattahoochee National Forest, I think in recent years, has harvested something like 1,300 acres a year. And that may not sound like that big of an area, but it's important to keep in mind that forests take a long time to develop. So I've heard people say, we should be cutting 1% of the forest a year. They propose that as kind of a reasonable compromise solution. But if you cut 1% of the forest a year and rotate it around the landscape, that would mean your oldest forest is 100 years old. And we've got a lot of 100-year-old forests, so we think of that as kind of mature and old these days. But many of our tree species live 200 and 300 years, and some of them depend on the forest actually being older than that. So talking about a 100-year-old forest as old is like talking about someone in their 30s as being a senior citizen. So our forests, really can only take a pretty low rate of cutting, and the national forest allows different amounts of cutting in different areas. Wilderness areas are the most protected, but more broadly, the forest is divided into two general categories: suitable for timber production and unsuitable for timber production. Unsuitable for timber production means they can't do anything specifically to produce timber. It can only happen as a byproduct of other activity. Like if a tornado goes through a campground, they can harvest timber in the process of cleaning up that campground. Versus areas that are suitable for timber production, they're still supposed to be focused on other goals like creating wildlife habitat and restoring ecological communities, but timber production can be an additional goal there. And the Forest Service would like me to point out that when they're doing timber production, they're not doing clear cuts these days. They are leaving some trees, and that's definitely true. Something like this is typical. Often they'll cut half the trees. Sometimes they'll cut up to 85 or 90% of the trees. But logging, even if you leave some of the trees, is not the same thing as a natural disturbance. So one important factor about logging is it impacts the whole ecosystem at once. So a windstorm is only going to affect the bigger trees. It's going to leave the smaller trees intact. If a wildfire comes through, it's generally just going to top kill the shrubs and saplings and not impact the bigger trees unless it's really intense. Versus a logging operation, even if the intent is just to harvest some of the bigger trees, they will also run over all the smaller trees and top kill them. And then another difference with logging is that the trees don't stay on site. They're taking the boles out of the forest. That's removing organic matter and nutrients. And a lot of the nutrients that they leave on site get piled up in specific locations, like around the log landings. And then the impact of logging goes beyond just the direct impact of the vegetation. There's infrastructure to support the logging, what the Forest Service calls temporary roads, but what I think would be better known as disposable roads, because like a red Solo cup that gets beer put in it at a party, these roads are used once and then kind of thrown away. And these roads lead to erosion like we're seeing here. And the most impactful part of the infrastructure are the log landings. This is where logs are loaded onto trucks and where trucks turn around. These are tractor trailers these days. So those log landings are a quarter acre to a half an acre, and the soil is really destroyed in those areas. Now, to be totally fair, there are places where restoration efforts require logging and some management is needed. So Georgia Forest Watch is not a zero-cut organization. We're not against all management. I think it's important to point out that even where management is needed, it's needed because people have altered physical conditions or species pool or the disturbances, the fundamental aspects of the ecosystem. So in the foreground here, we have smooth purple coneflower, which is a federally threatened species. It requires more open conditions. So some logging may be needed to restore sites for it. And the Forest Service does need to actively burn to maintain it, but that it really should be just putting back disturbances that we're missing from the landscape. And then even where that kind of management can be beneficial doesn't mean that it necessarily will be beneficial. So this is a site where about 40 years ago, the Forest Service tried to establish shortleaf pine, which is a native and declining species. And then more recently, they've come back and thinned it. And so the goal was establishing shortleaf pine. What you see here is there's one Virginia pine over on the right-hand edge. There's one shortleaf pine in the middle, and then everything else is white pine. So they were managing 4 shortleaf pine. They got mostly white pine and some Virginia pine, and then they cut out the Virginia pine. And then here's another site where they were trying to, again, establish shortleaf. This time they want it mixed in with some oak trees. They did a pretty intense harvest, cut out about 85% of the trees. And then some of the follow-up was a prescribed fire. Well, that prescribed fire killed most of the trees they reserved. So they didn't do a clear cut, but in this particular about 20-acre area, they wound up with something very similar to a clear cut. And this is an area where people can make a difference. Volunteers are needed to get out in the woods and comment on these projects. And one example of where that's made a real difference is the Brawley Mountain project over between Blairsville and Blue Ridge. The Forest Service did wind up cutting about 400 acres there, and there was some legitimate purpose to that. But they were initially proposing to cut some areas that really didn't make any sense at all. And citizens going out, looking at the project, speaking with the Forest Service, got the Forest Service to drop about 300 acres, including this area you're looking at right here. So we need volunteers to help monitor these projects. And Forest Watch has a specific district leader program where people make a commitment to monitor the area of forest around them, keep up with what's going on, and look out for it. So hopefully you can see yourself taking some action on, treating ash trees for emerald ash borer, reporting illegal trails, or getting involved in the district leader program to help monitor these areas.